on this episode of the WildFed podcast.
What looked just like a wild forest actually was providing everything they needed. And that changed me very powerfully.
I've been told by other permaculturalists I spend all my time in zone 5. I'm always out gathering, and it's getting harder.
I designed for neglect, changing climate, changing political situations, changing economies. And it looks pretty stormy out there. What is most likely to withstand that and actually increase in value?
Some of these really incredible seed banks that have been built, incredible, but it's like they're in vaults. I like a lot of what you're talking about is these genetics are in the ground, growing.
The nuts are really keystone to the healthy ecosystem. You know, all the animals are eating them. Then that goes down through the food chain.
As a modern day hunter, how's the acorns look? How's the beech nuts look? Because that is what determines where we're going to find game this year.
You can jump right in and get started. You'll just be amazed at how well it does on its own.
Episode 136 of the WildFed podcast. The future is nuts. Designing living systems with Michael Judd is brought to you by Retrieval. You've got to try the new naturally flavored colostrum from Retrieval. Chocolate with real cacao, vanilla with real vanilla extract, strawberry with real strawberry juice. I've been using colostrum daily and promoting it as a powerful nutritional supplement for over 15 years. In fact, I just had a quarter cup in my blended drink this morning and again this afternoon. With its ability to fortify your immune system, nourish and rebuild your gut lining, repair injuries, aid in muscle growth and recovery, and so much more, I think it's one of the most sophisticated food-based supplements we can include in our diet. Retrival's already known as the #1 source for premium colostrum, and now they've just released 3 new formulas: chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry. They're lightly sweetened with monk fruit and combined with MCT oil to make them more soluble in water and in blended drinks, all while having the same potency as Retrival's original colostrum. They're so good, I keep eating them by the spoonful right out of the tub. Eaten like that, they're like a powdered ice cream, but of course they make excellent blended drinks too. Again, these aren't those over-the-top fake flavors you taste in so many supplements today. These are flavored with real cacao, vanilla, and strawberry, so they taste great and really clean too. Go to Retrieval.com to see the entire lineup of health-promoting supplements and superfoods and use the coupon code WildFed for 5% off your order. Retrieval. Why just survive when you could thrive? Hey, are you a small business owner in the wild food space or a hobbyist forager looking for a side hustle? Then listen up. This episode's brought to you by Foraged.market, a website for buyers and sellers of wild and specialty foods from around the globe. Think Etsy, but for foods with a story. But it gets better. Not only do you get your own product page to promote your goods, they expose you to a constant stream of ideal buyers, foodies, chefs, and restaurants looking for raw ingredients or value-added products just like yours. Go over to foraged.market/wildfed to get started. While you're there, you'll also find a coupon for $10 off your first order of any of the incredible products there from other sellers. Foraged.market. Buy there, sell there, and learn more about their incredible vision and conservation ethic by listening to episode 122 of the WildFed podcast. Foraged.market, the global marketplace for wild and specialty foods. I'm Daniel Vitalis, and you're listening to the WildFed podcast, a show about reconnecting with nature through hunting, fishing, foraging, and food. WildFed. Food is all around you. Michael Judd is a really fascinating guy. He lives and has lived a truly inspiring life. Today, his focus is on, as he calls it, designing for neglect. That is, creating living food systems that function like natural ecosystems, providing long-term food security with very little input. Many of the species he works with are cultivars of plants we mostly think of as wild species, like America's iconic and only tropical fruit, the Paw Paw. While governments are busy trying to regulate cow farts and developing carbon offset credits, Michael has been building systems that truly integrate people in the landscape in ways that solve real and pressing problems, combining the indigenous knowledge he gained while living in Latin America with the permaculture design he learned living here in the States. From birth to death, and I mean that literally since we get into natural burial later in this episode, he's developed and implemented systems that dramatically increase his and his family's own sustainability in very real, relatable, and surprisingly simple ways. While I don't believe a utopia has or ever will exist, it's certainly entertaining to imagine what would happen if more people started to implement similar systems in their own lives. I'll be headed south to work with Michael in an upcoming episode of the third season of the WildFed TV show, so stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, prepare to be inspired. Michael's showing by example what we can do to increase the amount of nature, food, and personal sovereignty we can have when we start building self-managing living food systems. It can be done, and you can tell from listening to Michael, it can be very fun and fulfilling too. Michael Judd, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm pleased to be here.
Man, it's about time I got you on here.
Yeah.
You know, I initially found out about you because of your interest in your work and your book on Paw Paws. So I kind of had you in my mind as like a Paw Paw guy. And then as I started to dig in a little bit, I was like, oh, I need to zoom out. Paw Paws is like one small part of your world. So I was wondering if maybe we could kind of start off by giving people a big picture kind of background and bit of a bio on who you are and what you do.
Sure. The Paw Paw is actually kind of a great character to explain a lot of the journey I've lived, because it's really a tropical species that lives in the north. And I've split my lifetime between living in the tropics and the north. I am originally from Maryland, here in the mid-Atlantic, right along the Blue Ridge Mountains, and where I'm talking to you today. And I grew up here, but as soon as I was sort of, free to go on my own, I went and lived in rural Latin America, really all over. Started in South America, spent most of the time in Central America, about 12 years living in Nicaragua specifically, for many reasons, and also had some amazing experiences living with some of the indigenous cultures in southern Mexico, modern day southern Mexico, and just living and learning in areas where growing your own food and providing what you needed and how to support each other was all there was, and I loved it.
When you first went there, though, was food or a principal interest, or did you go down there with something else in mind and then kind of narrow down onto that?
No, I didn't grow up in necessarily a culture or a family that was, growing a lot of its own food or, learning a lot of those skills. It was more uh, kind of on the edge of suburbia and sort of farmland. So I did have some freedom to explore and be, but no, I went down to Latin America. I was young. I was feeling rebellious. I wanted to get out. So I did. I went down, had an opportunity to go live first in Argentina, and it changed my life in the sense that I loved it because it was somewhat chaotic. I'd come from a world with so many rules and laws, and
Right.
and you could almost expect what to see walking down the street. And then when I went down there, it was chaos and randomness. And I love that, especially at that age. I've come a little bit full circle with that here, but at the time, it was wonderful medicine and opened my world up.
I wish more kids were doing that today, because like that culture shock, as they sometimes call it, and realizing that your way of life is just one way of life. I just feel like my wife and I are constantly talking about the younger generations that we know seem like they're traveling internationally less than I think our generations did. And so, because I remember the first time I experienced those kind of things, and it, like you said, it's life-changing, life-altering.
It did. It changed my path. One of the things that struck me was the poverty. Seeing entire cities of hovels. Children playing in sewage. Swollen bellies, all this stuff I'd never seen. I'd never realized that this really existed. Um, and that changed my life. That changed the direction that I began to take in wanting to, try to help alleviate some of those situations that I saw. And so I kept coming back to Latin America and learning skills. And that's when I really started getting into working with growing food and working with perennial food systems. The biggest shift happened when I was living in Chiapas, southern state of Mexico. And I was living in the highland capital of San Cristobal de las Casas. And one day I saw what looked like a statue, like a Mayan statue, like the stela, the carving in human form walking down the street. It was a young man wearing just a white, simple tunic. He had straight bangs and long hair, and his face was from like another world. So I just naturally followed him. I was just fascinated. And finally, we stopped and kind of did a lot of gesticulating with each other to figure out, what each other's story was. And his story was that he'd come out of the jungle and was looking for help because, he was having stomach issues. It sounded like parasites and things like that, and that his gods weren't responding. So he was coming out looking for help.
Wow.
And I had been learning and designing and building compost toilets. So I thought, okay, well, hey, if you'll let me, I'll come back with you. Little did I know what I was asking, because he was a member of one of the last of the Lacandon Mayan tribes, which, a little over 100 years ago, there was only 100 of them. 500 years ago, they had sort of escaped the conquistadores and gone into the heart of the jungle where they couldn't be pursued. Yeah, so they literally escaped, Christianity and all that. But with modern day, the jungle was being cut, more and more. And of course, the army was wanting to get in there. This was during the time of the Zapatista uprising as well. And so their traditional way of living in a balanced way with their environment was fragmenting. And part of that was that they were having to live closer together. So their cycles of, of human manure and stuff like that, which normally was balanced with the system, became concentrated. Dogs were getting in there, and the cycle was passing. And the younger generation and the children's stuff were filled with basically parasites. And so I said, okay, if you'll let me come back in. And so we did. We went up an old dry riverbed for about 4 days to get into the heart of this jungle. And
Did he get any help in town first before you guys left?
No.
Let me go. I can build compost toilets. I have the solution.
Yeah. All I had was like a printout. I had a printout, this little simple printout of how to build a toilet in Spanish.
What?
And, I was like, all right, it was just like life coming to me, which is the way I always live. And so I went in, and they, when I first arrived, they were very reticent about having anybody from the outside in, because that's how they had survived, without having, outsiders come in. So they had a meeting, they got all together, and I was allowed to be there. And, half of them were saying, look, our children are sick. And the other half were like, hey, we can't have new members come in. Anyway, they worked it out, and they decided that we could build a compost toilet on sort of a communal ground.
You spoke Spanish? Did any of them speak Spanish, or how are you?
A little bit. They spoke a little bit of Spanish from doing trading, coming in and out and trading. But I'm telling you, it was a lot of sign language.
Wow.
and a lot of gesticulating and and some drawing and scratching on the ground.
Yeah.
And, it was. I mean, it was awesome where they lived. There was nothing sort of modern. The way they built, their structures and everything was from, vines and saplings and thatch, and they just lived, in the jungle, in the environment.
Okay. Doing like NOPA type agriculture?
A little bit, but really it was very perennial system, and that's really that's what I'm going to share here, because that's really what changed. Again, my direction in working with living systems, and food and all of it, building the whole shebang. So we were allowed to do it on a public piece of land there, And I started, living there, basically camping out and going into what at first looked just like wild jungle. Like it just looked like jungle and nothing else to me at first. And we'd go in there and we'd start harvesting the materials, for everything that was needed. And I started realizing that they were intimately interacting with this entire perennial jungle system
Yeah.
around them for their food, for their fibers, for their medicines, for everything. The building, everything was coming from that environment. What looked just like a wild forest actually was providing everything they needed. And that changed me very powerfully in understanding, actually experiencing that as a species, as a human species, that we actually can live, for multiple generations, eons, from the same environment by working in balance with it. And that's not like anything I'd seen from where I'd come from.
Mm-hmm.
We all know we all know what that is.
Mm-hmm.
A very linear system that kind of consumes and creates waste streams and just depletes very quickly. But that system was constantly regenerating and being productive for all their needs. So yeah, we built it. We made adobe. We went and got saplings from like a little bit of a burned area. They would let their milpas burn like in a traditional way for like 6 or 7 years. Go dormant. Then they would burn them and take the small saplings out and do building with it. And they would move on a very long rotation with their burning, which is more traditional. And did cut thatch and thatch the roof, and this thing was gorgeous. I mean, I wanted to live in it when I was done. But at the very end, I got very sick myself. I got riddled with all the things that I was there to try and help alleviate, and pretty much
Was it worms?
barely made it out of the jungle.
Worms or well,
Yeah, amoebas,
mhm.
giardia. I mean, who knows? I mean,
Right.
when you go into the environment, when you go to the tropics in general,
Yeah.
you go down on the food chain. Everything
Yeah, you
starts
do.
eating you
Well said.
inside out.
Yeah.
It was worth it
Yeah.
though, and that's saying something. It
Yeah.
was worth it.
Yeah. Wow. So, how old were you at that point?
Oh, how old was I? I would say 23.
Okay, life's still pretty
I
simple
was
then, and you can
23.
just hang out in the jungle for a while, and so
Yeah.
no
Yes.
responsibilities yet. Or,
Well, I guess that was kind of a turning point because then after that, I still, well, that's all started like a healing journey for me,
mm,
and trying to understand how to heal the body. And that drew me even closer to working with the earth. And I started working with biodynamic farming, and then I did some arid land farming. And then I started working with permaculture and started going really, and I started living in different parts of Latin America. So I was living in rural parts of Latin America and working with, campesinos and people that were working the land in a different way, but still not too distantly related to working with the perennial systems, and certainly living with each other as community still. So I started bouncing between rural Latin America, and coming back home in the States and interacting with permaculture, and just started hybridizing those, and still do.
mhm.
A lot of what I do is a mix of my experience and then my intuition. So it's hard to kind of pinpoint a title for me. I kind of fly under the banner of permaculture because it's the closest umbrella to a lot of the things that I work with.
You've got some projects too. Maybe you could talk to us about those because you've got, yeah. Is there? So there's the Ecologia edible and ecological landscape design, and then the Project Bonafide, and then the silviculture. Could you kind of like tell us a little bit about some of those projects and what those are?
Yeah, yeah. So Project Bonafide is a project nonprofit I started in Nicaragua in 2001, and really kind of with that vision of trying to help create food security, basically through perennials, through fruits, nuts, bamboos, palms, creating these diversified, food forests, similar to what I experienced living in the jungle with the Lacandon Mayans, but adapted to more modern realities. How does this make economic sense? How does this really work? Culturally, where I was at there in rural Nicaragua as well. So it was something I was really learning a lot while I was doing. But I really started again kind of on my own. I'd bought a piece of property on Isla Ometepe Island, which is an inland island. It's one of the largest islands in a freshwater lake in the world.
Oh, neat. Okay.
And in this, yeah, it's fantastic. It's a magical place, and it's in the south west corner of Nicaragua, just above the Costa Rica border. And it's a huge island. It's like 12 miles end to end. It's two big volcanoes, actually,
Wow.
one semi-active, and the other with a lagoon in the top and sort of cloud forest wrapping down it. And so I ended up, starting this project sort of on the far side of that dormant volcano, and very rural, very isolated area. The closest little hamlet, is a very small town without any resources really from the outside. And I started with just a machete and a vision, and started hacking away and building structures, and put up a nursery, and started collecting seeds, and really started working with understanding what the locals were interested in, but then with a real focus on, okay, well, what does well? So in permaculture, we observe what is doing well naturally in any environment. We're not preoccupied if it's native or non-native. It's just like, okay, what is thriving here? And mangoes were just pumping there, without any input. So I'm like, okay, well, mangoes are pumping here. So let's work with that energy, but let's diversify it. Let's get different grafted cultivars of mangoes that will start to produce at different months of the year. So that, number one, there's food at hand, there's food security, but then you have a market niche. So you can start making, income from this perennial food source, with the understanding that, okay, if we're making good money from these perennials, then we can, potentially stop, slashing and burning every year to plant dry land rice, beans, and corn, which was, creating erosion and soil fertility loss. And that's what's happening in most parts of the world, is this quick annual slash and burn plant, and then everything erodes away. And then you've lost your fertility and your access to food.
Can I ask a quick tangential question? And I don't want to get you off track of the story you're telling us. Do you note that frequently slash and burn agriculture gets conflated with traditional fire use amongst people that did have harmonious life ways? Because it seems like
Yes.
burning was very important, but everybody thinks you're talking about slash and burn.
Right. And you remember I mentioned earlier, living with the Lacandon Maize, they were doing it more on like a 7-year cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And that allows the land to, really become fertile. It allows sort of roots of the saplings and the shrubs and the bushes that come up to really get into the soil, to feed the soil organic matter, and to sort of hold it in place. So even when they did burn it, it had structure and form in the soil. Mm-hmm. It was held, and they'd come back in, within sort of the stubble and rubble of all that, and plant, the beans, the corns, and the squash. And so when it rained, you weren't losing your soil.
Yeah.
Whereas when you do it every year, you're planting just annuals,
right?
So there's really no root depth or anything holding the soil. That soil literally just slides right down, the hillside.
Mm-hmm.
And most people are operating on hillsides because they're marginalized. The more wealthy have the lower lands, and everybody else is pushed up to the hillsides. And hills traditionally, in cultures that maintain the healthy, ecosystem around them, were used for perennials. You didn't consistently clear and do annuals,
right?
Or intense, animals on hillsides. You did that in the lowlands. So slash and burn has gotten a bad name from the practice that is that annual slash and burn, and that you see all over the world. It's mostly, I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but that's comes from debt relief. IMF, World Bank, these policies against the countries dictate what they grow, and they're encouraged to grow cash crops, commodities, things that they can sell to pay off their debt.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're taught to grow rice, beans, and corns where they had a more traditional perennial system. So that's where that kind of newer way of slashing and burning, because if if they don't have the chemicals, that's the same thing. That's burning.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
they
Chemical
use
burn.
fire. Yeah, it's the same. But so yes, burning in a balanced way can be extremely beneficial. Can release a lot of needed nutrients right where it's needed.
But so back to where you were saying sort of to be able to have these mango cultivars there allowed you to create an economic
Right.
model that could prevent some of that.
Right. So then the concept being that they could start to plant those starting around the edges of their fields, not saying, hey, stop what you're doing and try this, but let's add something and diversify it. So that was the basis of that, and it went really well. The project has grown a lot. We started doing a lot of permaculture courses there. It became a very international volunteer space as well as a real interactive space with the community, and we gathered genetics from all over the tropical belts. And so right now that place is actually a genetic repository
Wow.
of some of the most amazing species and cultivars of fruits, nuts, bamboos, palms. I mean, it's just a cornucopia. So no matter what happens in the short term, that's a big seed bank right there. That's a propagation space that can be pulled from if and when people start to need and want to interact with it. And that's still a lot of what I focus on. That's what I'm doing here now, is sort of building up these genetic repositories, collecting these amazing cultivars and species that have been selected and discovered and cultivated for hundreds of years in the temperate climate, and some are starting to get kind of lost as well because they're not being interacted with very much. So it's like, okay, let's get those, let's plant these. So here and now for me in the temperate zone, that's American persimmons, that's select black walnuts, that's Paw Paws, cultivars of mulberries,
Wow.
honey locusts, that are huge potted honey locusts
Oh
with
wow.
amazing amounts of sugar and carbohydrates in them. So that theme is what I still do, but I've brought myself back to living in the U.S. about 11 years now. I've come back. My parents are aging, and I decided, okay, well, I don't want to be so far as that happens, and um, sort of reinvented myself here when I landed and started Ecologia, edible and ecological landscapes, and sort of began translating uh, all that I understand and do with plants and whole system design to the culture here, which is now very suburban. We're sort of a bedroom community to Washington D.C., Baltimore. We're in this Mid Atlantic corridor, which is like where the majority of the population of this entire country lives. And so it's like, okay, well, what are they interested in? Looking through their cultural eyes, how to start begin to share some of these understandings where they're ready to interact. So that was kind of the premise of Ecologia, and sort of started doing really attractive swales, these raised beds on contour that also harvest the water but are
Mhm.
aesthetically beautiful. Herb spirals, working with stone and
Mhm.
spirals and creating these habitats and this edible architecture at the same time. Working with hugelkultur beds and earthen ovens, and and working with what grows really easily. One of the things I say a lot now is I design for neglect,
Yeah.
and realizing that, yeah, and just realizing that people are very busy,
Yep.
that they have these great ideas and interests, but ultimately sometimes they're too busy. So I'm like, okay, well then let's just start for neglect, and that way if it happens, it's all good. And permaculture actually works in that way as well. With permaculture, you're setting up these systems that are based on how natural ecosystems work, how natural things happen, and because they're very successful. They're the most successful systems that we have. So we sort of imitate those on our landscapes, adapt them, imitate them, but then they work for themselves. They function very much for themselves and reduce your inputs. And that just, that there is designing for neglect. And we can talk about that a little bit more, and how I design a food forest and how I built the food forest here and then did neglect it for many years as we built our circular straw bale house, and it did just fine.
We'll get back to the show in a moment, but first, I'm proud to announce that we've recently started filming for Season 3 of WildFed on the Outdoor Channel, which should start airing beginning of 2023. But until then, Season 2 of WildFed is now on the air. From the 17-year periodical cicadas of Brood 10 to giant Atlantic bluefin tuna to the bison of Standing Rock's Great Plains, Season 2 of WildFed is filled with unique hunts, forages, and incredible wild harvested meals, and no shortage of adventure. Watch Monday nights at 7:30 p.m. Eastern and again at 10:30 p.m. on Outdoor Channel. Hey, if you don't have cable, you can still watch the show live as it airs on friendlytv.com. That's spelled friendly without vowels, FRNDLY TV.com. You can get a free trial subscription if you want to watch Season 2, and after that, it's just $6.99 per month. Here at WildFed, we're so proud to have a second season on the air, and we really hope you'll tune in either on Outdoor Channel or friendlytv.com. Now, back to the show. One of the things that's coming up for me over the years, being a forager, and I got very little kind of horticultural experience. You know, we don't have gardens or even any beds here at my house. I mean, we've got some land here, and we don't utilize it in that way, only because as I've been told by other permaculturalists, I spend all my time in Zone 5. I'm always like out gathering, you know, and it's getting harder. Even in the, last several years, with the amount of land that's being posted, no trespassing, with the pushback against foraging, it's changing really fast. It's getting a lot harder to access things. People see you foraging and then they'll cut that area down or they'll block that area off. So it's almost like an increasingly, I hate to say it, but almost like a hostility that I'm feeling towards foraging in certain places. So it's making me realize, like, okay, my long-term play is not utilizing other people's land and other open spaces to get my food. It's just not realistic. So I really need to create forageable landscapes here where I live. And so I'm super fascinated by all of this, and also, what you've picked up on. Tell me real quick just about your transition home. I'm just super curious. Like, was that an easy transition, or was that a challenge to set yourself up and begin initiating the kind of things that you'd done in Latin America back home? And also, was it frustrating to come face to face again with the strip malls and the golf courses and the all the things that stand as impediments to this kind of a thing?
My instant sort of reaction is it was not very hard for me. I was met with I came back at the right time. The genesis of interest in all of this,
Oh yeah, right.
was really kind of just beginning. And so I've been met with interest since I've returned. If I'd come back 15 or 20 years ago, I might,
Yeah.
it may not have rooted at all. But it did work. It has worked out very well for me. And I've gone through my own evolution of now really kind of moving away from that edible landscape suburban design. And now I'm working more with agroforestry, nuts, really kind of what you were just kind of pointing at. How do we create these sort of forageable landscapes, that we've put some intention into creating, but not a whole lot of work, not a whole lot of high input or maintenance, but a lot of return. And
is that a return in your lifetime? Like when you talk about building a forageable landscape, I'm thinking, oh, great, over the next couple of years we're harvesting. When you say agroforestry, I start thinking, like, is this for the next generation, or is this something you'll experience in your life?
It's both. It depends how intense you want it to be. So there's different sort of models for agroforestry. There's from, low input to more high input. And so a higher input system, we start getting you returns within a couple of years. And a lower input, it might be more like 6-8 years when you're starting to really start bringing in your nut harvests. So I can outline some of that because that's really what I'm
Yeah,
fascinated
please do.
in
Please do.
with. And I started another nonprofit a couple of years ago called Silvoculture that's based here in the Mid-Atlantic, and its tagline is, we're nuts for the future.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think
Thank you.
another
I need a
tagline
dad joke
is
like that.
yeah, or you could say the future is nuts. Um, and through my own evolution of what is most valuable, certainly from my own life and time and knowledge, and what is what's gonna help create the greatest good, for as many as possible, and not just humans, for the whole system.
Right.
And that narrows down to nuts. Like many of us, I've really gone down the rabbit hole of future scenario planning and looking at, juxtaposing changing climate, changing political situations, changing economies, and it looks pretty stormy out there, right? So it's like, okay,
Yeah, it does.
so what is most likely to sort of withstand that and actually increase in value as those systems do what they're going to do? And nut trees really sort of became a very clear understanding for me out of all of that. And nut trees have proven that in the past during inclement times, human history. Even World War II is a great example, where areas in Italy and Corsica and France, where they were isolated during the war without food, they literally survived on the chestnuts. And the
Mm.
chestnut is known as the bread tree, and it's just it's a phenomenal species. It's a phenomenal food security, and it's also a phenomenal economic opportunity. And it's also one of the main focuses of silvoculture. And we can narrow in on chestnuts as well. But that understanding, really brought me to want to focus on nut trees and as many as possible. We kind of have this challenge of helping to get 1 million nut trees planted, in the Mid-Atlantic area.
That's part of the
And
silviculture project. That's a goal of it.
yes, and not plant them ourselves, but help
Mhm.
them get planted. Help create the understanding, the education, access to the materials to doing it. So we do a lot of educational stuff as well. So so those systems, those agroforestry systems, can be quite simple, and they usually do begin with an open area. There's a lot of open hay fields around where we are. A lot of wealthy people now own land they don't know what to do with, so they just kind of keep having the hay cut every year or two to keep their
Mhm.
agricultural status. And a lot of farming enterprises aren't making it economically, with the corn and the soy and what they've done traditionally. So there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of interest in, okay, well, what can we do here? And so a very simple layout for agroforestry would be 40 foot, rows 40 foot apart. And within those rows, you could plant your nut trees every 20 or every 40 foot. And then you could maintain cutting the hay in between, or, if you wanted to be more intensive with it, you could even do annual crops for many years in between that to keep your
Mm.
income going. You could go more perennial and you could start planting elderberries and raspberries, rhubarb, asparagus. You could do some perennial high return vegetables and fruits in that alleyway during the interim. And that's answering your question, was this something I'll see returns on, in a short term? So yeah, in a couple of years, you could be picking your berries. Your nuts, your chestnuts will start to produce at 6 years of age. Now, these
Oh,
are
wow.
hybrid chestnuts. These are
Okay.
hybrid. I'm not talking about bringing back the American chestnut. I'm not involved in that at all. I am focused on highly productive, proven, chestnut genetics, and they're out there, and they're actually being interacted with a lot right now in the U.S. It's really kind of catching on quickly, and there's a great organization out in the Midwest called the Savannah Institute that's doing a lot of research and a lot of sharing of the chestnut and a lot of these other high return both, in the sense of food, but then also economically, perennial foods and agroforestry systems. So silviculture is realistically also focusing on how can this be economically viable, because our landscapes are dictated by, our economy. And so it's a reality. So it's like, okay, well, let's work with that. We want this to really spread beyond just a small group. Let's show how this actually makes really good money. And across the country, the people that are doing the hybrid chestnuts are making a really good living. It's actually one of the highest returns per acre for any legal crop in the country.
What these are
Yeah.
resistant to? What was the disease that's done so much damage to the
It's
American
the
blight?
chestnut blight.
Right. So
Yes,
these are resistant to that?
yes, they are resistant to
Yeah.
that, and these are largely Asian genetics. So,
Okay.
the chestnut, like us humans, we all started in one spot, and then, as the world changed and grew and split apart, there was a lot of adaptation. So the chestnut also has a different development in Europe. The European chestnut has a different development in China and Korea. It changed here. The American chestnut. So there's all these different genetics around the world, and other cultures have worked more intimately with them. So in Asia, China, Korea, and Japan, they've worked intimately with the chestnut, for eons, because it's such an amazing food source. They get it. They've gone through the cycles that this young country is yet to do, and realizing, the importance of food security and nutrient dense foods. And so they've got a lot of good cultivars. They've got a lot of good genetics developed that are doing very well over here. Largely the Asian chestnut. The Latin is Mollissima.
These chestnuts are
Yeah.
similar to what I would, like Christmas time. I buy chestnuts at the store. They're similar compositionally.
Yes. Actually, they're probably better. They're
Okay,
probably
yeah.
tastier than those.
So I want to ask about that too, because compositionally they seem, most of the nuts, when I think of them, they tend to be mostly lipid and protein, but a little lower carbohydrate. And then when I think about chestnuts, it's like eating cake. They
Exactly.
seem to have that beautiful complex potato-like starch that turns quite sweet when cooked.
It's so good. It's like sweet potato,
Yeah.
like sweet potato on a tree.
Right.
And yes, it's almost all carbohydrate, so it has almost no oil in it,
Wow.
which means that it can be stored.
Yeah.
You dry it and you can store it for 1-2 years easily, and that's what really also interests me about it. When you go back to that sort of down the rabbit hole food security thing, it's like, well, wow, this is our nutrient rich flour. This is what we
Right.
can
Right.
store and live on if need be. And then of course it can value add into all kinds of products. It's gluten free. It's good for your heart. I see it coming into cereals and bars and things in the
Right.
future, because it's being grown more and more. More and more acres are rapidly being planted in the U.S. Over the last 5 years. There's really been quite a growth in the interest in the planting of it, because there's a huge market demand for it. The U.S. imports 88% of the chestnuts it consumes, and we can grow them, and then we can actually have them in better condition than the ones that are being imported. So just on an economic view of it, it's just a great supply demand ratio.
What are some other, and I'll actually just want to say real quick, my fallback apocalyptic survival food is always acorns, but as I'm sure the amount of processing that go into it is just so obnoxious that to turn it into food, and the idea of this carbohydrate rich cake-like food on trees seems almost like utopian to me to have a plant.
It's amazing. That's why I'm so excited about it. And looking at all the options, and having lived a lot of realities, and lived half my life at least in areas where food scarcity was real, and makes you think about it. And I come back here, and I'm looking around me, and the food that we're all eating is not grown here at all.
Right.
It's coming from afar. It has very low nutrient value, and I see a lot of food insecurity here, and it's a very thin layer. between everybody and and food, but they
Right.
don't realize it.
It's really
So
hard
fair
to
enough.
imagine a future. It's hard for me to imagine an immediate future. So I'm talking the next couple decades where food security does not become one of the biggest issues that we face. And then, when I look at
Absolutely.
what the these terms are also loaded, but sort of the global elites or whoever, the people who are sort of issuing policy ideas, they seem so much more interested in like a 3D printed food approach made from whatever
Hmm.
cash commodity crops than they are in promoting, like localized, ecologically sound
Yeah.
food systems. And so, and then I also wanted to mention, I'm reading Dan Saladino's book, Eating to Extinction, right now. And so quite a bit of, but that's about, the genetic loss from our, largely in horticulture, some in wild too. And he keeps talking about some of these really incredible seed banks that have been built, like, the one up in, I think it's Svalbard,
Yep.
in Norway. And, incredible, but it's like, they're in vaults, man. Like I like a lot of what you're talking about is these genetics are in the ground, growing, not like
Right.
not living on trays and in containers, at sub-zero temperatures hidden in a rock shelter somewhere. Cause it
Right.
seems like, hey,
Right.
we should
Right.
probably plant this stuff, not just talk about it. So when I look at like
Yeah.
the global big picture of sort of where policymakers want to take us with food, and then when I look at what's happening at the grassroots, they couldn't be more different. Obviously, you've invested in this, so this is the direction you see being more sound. But yeah, how do you see
Yeah.
that big picture? Like, how do you see all this playing out over the next couple decades with food?
Well, let me go back a step. I wanted to reply to your acorn comment there. So acorns are mast trees, and meaning that they produce, often every other
Yeah,
year.
kind of
Some
intermittent.
Right, sometimes every 3 years. So another one of the amazing qualities of the chestnut is they are annual bearers.
Wow.
So you
Okay.
have this consistent annual food
Yeah.
source, and they're highly productive. Now, I
How
don't
many mature
necessarily.
trees would a family need for their own, like how many trees, if
Oh,
I grew them here, like how many would I need?
you'd probably be plenty with four.
Wow.
Because I mean, so not that I suggest necessarily planting just an acre of just chestnuts because it's good to mix things up. But if you did, and let's say you had approximately 50 trees per acre, after they really start hitting their stride in productivity, after 10, 12 years getting up there, you're looking at 2,000 plus pounds of harvest per year. So you're talking mega production here.
Right, right.
You're talking a glut of nutrient rich, carbohydrate rich food every year. So you got food security covered, but then you've got a great market niche.
Yeah.
And we're going to start realizing more and more, become more aware, even technologically, about nutrient density in food. There's now technology where you can test food and get the nutrient density, and it probably won't be too long. I mean, there's probably going to be some kickback from the food industry and stuff, but at some point there'll probably be an app where you can go to the store and you can put it up against a bag of carrots, and it's going to give you the nutrient density in
Oh,
that bag of
yeah.
carrots.
Okay.
You go to another bag of carrots from a different farm, and
Yeah.
you're going to say, "Oh, wow, this is 3 times as much."
Thank
And
God
if you
too,
have this,
because what a game changer. Because I
yeah,
constantly have people ask me, like you're just saying about carrots, like, cause somebody goes like, well, are carrots good for me? It's like, well, which carrots are we talking about? Who grew them? Where'd they grow? It's like, it's not often the food, it's the quality of the food. And people get confused about that because they've been taught that everything
yeah.
is fungible, like as if they're all just like an apples and apples and apple, where it's like, man, it couldn't be more further from the truth.
Yes, and that's one of the reasons I like to focus on perennials, and we can talk a little bit about that. You're talking about how how I see the future and all this stuff. The future, on the physical level is a reduction in resources and a reduction in quality of resources, and then a continued growth in population. You just put those two against each other, and you can start
Mm.
to think
Hmm.
about what some of the scenarios are going to be. But things are going to become more expensive to do, and we've become accustomed to an annual style of agriculture and lifestyle, and really high in carbs, and that's based on having inexpensive oil to do all the farming and the chemical sprays and all of that. And as that becomes more expensive, food's are going to get more expensive. The nutritional value of that food is already low, and it's only going to get lower as well because the soils are depleted. Whereas
diesel's over $6 today as we're having this conversation, at least where I am.
Yes. And that, this is just the beginning, and that's not doomsdaying. That's just looking at.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's been that way in a lot of other countries for a while too. So it's our time,
True. So one of the reasons I like to focus on the perennials is for energy in, for energy out. And so with perennials, when I talk about perennials, I mean fruit trees, nut trees, usually woody perennials, that are living, 3+ years. And so you put your energy really into getting them established one time. And then with good design, there's very little maintenance and upkeep. Really, it's just harvesting. And that input for output return is huge. And of course, it takes a little bit of thought, design, and a little bit of time, just a little bit of time lag, which I think is where most people get caught up, and not thinking about investing for anything beyond, the first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, a year. But by taking that little bit of time investment and design and going for it, the dividends are huge and are long paying. With the chestnuts, they live for hundreds of years. Black walnuts, hundreds of years. So you're not just doing something, for your immediate family and future. You're doing this for generations to come and for the entire ecosystem, because the nuts are really keystone to the healthy ecosystem. All the animals are eating them, and then that goes down through the food chain, and they're really sort of in many ecosystems, sort of very key to it all.
If I understand it correctly, if I understand it correctly too, and it's something that's come up on the show a lot now, is that prior to European contact here, nut trees were heavily promoted throughout the eastern seaboard, right? So it's like a lot of areas where there were essentially this kind of thing was already being done, maybe at a slightly more wild tending level, but
yes,
it wasn't like we're kind of reinventing something that already happened here. And in some places, stands of those trees are still present, right? And those genetics are still there.
Absolutely. I mean, the indigenous peoples that lived in this northern climate are wonderful to sort of learn from, especially if you're looking at a future without a lot of the resources that we currently have. And it's to live in the north in the cold through the winter. You need those fats, those carbohydrates, which come from the nuts, the roots, the animals. So my understanding is that a lot of the eastern seaboard was somewhat all sort of wild tended, in the sense that certain trees that had good productivity, especially the nut trees, were selected and cleared around. And a lot of that traditional burning also of the understory was a way to sort of, help those to prosper. But then that also brought in, the game. So all of the nuts falling,
right.
Brought in the animals, and then that burned understory gave clear shooting and, for the bows and arrows and the spears to be able to hunt. So the nut trees, not just for the nuts themselves, were really key in feeding the animals and then, feeding the humans as well. So nuts, the hickories, very much the hickories, the chestnut. I mean, almost like every 1 in 3 trees used to be a chestnut along the eastern seaboard, like an insane amount. Chestnuts, but the hickories and the pecans. The pecan is a hickory,
right? And
there are northern pecans that are growing well up into our region. So yeah, there's an abundance to work with, and a lot of good genetics that have been selected from the predecessors here.
Yeah. Even as a modern day hunter, this is the time of year where we're all talking to each other like, how's the mast look this year? How's the acorns look? How's the beech nuts look? Because that is what determines where we're going to find game this year. And so when you get one of those years like last year where there's no acorns, it gets challenging because there's nowhere to concentrate animals. And so, it's like still going on today.
Well, I'll tell you what, you plant a chestnut,
Yeah.
system, and you'll know exactly where they're going to be and when they're going to be there, and then it's going to
Yeah.
be there every year. We recently acquired a property just down the street from where I live that's got a 60-year-old Chinese chestnut orchard on it.
Wow.
10 acres of
Wow.
these beautiful, majestic, totally mature producing trees, which is really just almost
Wow.
unheard of. Yeah, it's really kind of very
Was
interesting
it
how it's
was it valued by the seller the way
no,
you would value it? No.
no,
That's
no,
awesome. That's so
no,
great. I love
nobody.
it.
I'm just grateful that we scooped it,
Yeah.
and there's another 8 acres of select black walnuts,
Oh
northern
man.
pecans. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a gem, and anyway, it's loaded with wildlife. In the fall, I mean,
Hmm.
there's bear, there's deer, there's all the critters. I mean,
Wow.
they literally migrate from all around
I bet.
down to that property.
I bet. Oh, I'd like to come visit that. That sounds
Yeah.
really nice.
Well, you
Uh,
come September, you check it
yeah,
out.
man, I'm excited. Yeah, yeah. And for the listeners, I'm looking forward to getting down to work with you this year for the WildFed TV show. So, really excited to meet you in person. And man, it looks like the way you're living, your home is so unique down there. I was wondering if you wanted to say a little bit about some of that as well. And in particular, I'd like to, if it's okay with you, I'd like to trend toward. I just would be remiss not to ask you about some of, I guess, the natural burial stuff that you're involved with too. So
Mm,
I want to kind of get
yeah.
there, although I don't want to
Okay.
immediately transition there. But I'm kind of curious a little bit about
Yeah.
your lifestyle at home, and then some of that as well, because it really brings things full circle. Like the idea of being involved in all this stuff my whole life, and then my last act to be like one big middle finger to the ecology of the world with you know all the preservatives
Yeah.
pumped into me as I go in the ground seems freaky. So I kind of want to get to that too. But
Yeah.
but yeah, your home looks so unique, man. I've seen it now in some video, and on your website and stuff. So
Yeah. It's like the landscape in the sense that it really sort of functions for itself without inputs. It's a circular, round wood, timber framed straw bale house that we built ourselves from the woods around us. We're stewards of about 25 acres of woods here in this little Appalachian holler, which used to be a farm. 60, 70 years ago, it was soybeans and cows, and now it's this towering forest of poplars, tulip poplars, which is amazing, the regeneration power. But very beautiful straight trees. When Hurricane Sandy hit, I was just starting to design the house, and it was literally a windfall of trees that came down to begin that. That was the only
oh,
easy
neat.
part.
Yeah.
That was the only easy part. And I wanted to live in the round because living in Latin America and in Nicaragua, I was living in these, I was building these circular structures and just realizing how they made me feel,
Mm-hmm.
how they allowed, my
Yeah.
psychology to sort of rest and feel at ease. And then I was also feeling the energies of what I was building with down there. So I wanted to make sure that I was living in a structure that was going to just help me be well. And so, yeah, it's phenomenal. We got over 550 straw bales in it. We have earthen plasters on the inside, earthen floors throughout. The outside has traditional lime plaster. We have beautiful, vibrant living roof full of just multicolored sedums on it. It's like this
Mhm.
funky hairdo. It's really, really gorgeous. We heat the whole thing with a masonry stove, sort of like a soapstone style,
Oh, cool.
that heats the whole house with just one large armful of wood a day in the coldest of the winter here.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, that's it. You burn it, it burns down, and you shut the whole thing up, and it just slowly flywheel radiates heat out, and this really nice warmth that just kind of like hugs and wraps around you. And then the house itself, the earthen floors and plaster sort of act as a heat battery bank as well. And it stays nice and cool in the summer. The roof,
Mm.
having that soil and the plants, keeps the heat that radiates down into houses, which is where most of the heat comes from in structures, is eliminated. And we
Mhm.
got nice thick walls, and the earthen plasters actually absorb excess humidity and balance it inside.
Oh, wow. That's a bonus where
Yeah,
you are,
it's yes,
especially. Yeah.
so we don't have air conditioning, we don't have heating, so we don't have those high inputs systems. The house really kind of functions really well for itself. We have a compost toilet and we have gray water. So all the water from our sinks, washer, and tub just gravity feed out past the house into a shallow trough with a couple of raised beds with pawpaws and currants and gooseberries growing on it.
Yeah.
So there's no systems there. It's just literally all gravity fed. We have a well. We are hooked up to electricity, but we don't use much. And we have a backup hand pump for the well, which I think is a really key piece for people who have a well to get a hand pump, because if electricity goes out, 2-3 days a week, whatever, water is really your first need. And if you have something you can stick on your well and manually pump it, then you don't necessarily have to go anywhere to seek that water.
Hmm.
So that's a simple, easy one. In the north, heat and water are the two main design factors for your first considerations of security. So yeah, and actually the whole house sits on a rubble trench foundation. So the foundation for it is just packed gravel, which kind of
Wow.
also acts as like a French drain. So any water moving under under toward the house through the earth actually gets also channeled away.
Right.
Um, and so there's nothing there to fail in the ground. So keep that roof good. It should be hundreds of years that it's
Is it? I
there.
was going to ask how old is it and how is it holding up?
It's wonderful. We were about 6 years now. It took us about 4 or 5 years, mixed up with life.
Hmm.
Having a
Yeah.
baby, burying my father,
Yeah.
writing a book,
Wow.
all having a kid, all that stuff. Got mixed up, but now gratefully it's been about 6 years that we're living in it, and it's a joy. It's so nice. It's so nice to be in. People love it. Like it's a real gravitational piece, which I appreciate, and I put a lot of extra time, thought into it and money into it to make it look really good so that it would inspire people
Right.
to be like, well, it's not like a hippie shack in the woods. It's actually this gorgeous, very modern, yet traditional, earthen, natural home. So it is really wonderful. You'll see it
It's
when you
stunning.
come.
Yeah, it's stunning from what I've seen. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll put a link actually to a photo, maybe from some of your web media, so people can see, because it's so cool.
Yep. And
Um,
like you said, I got some YouTubes that show it
yeah.
as well.
You mentioned burying your father, and if I recall, in the video I was watching, you were being interviewed about green
Mm.
or natural or home burial, and it sounded like maybe that was the impetus to some of that. And I just wanted to ask about that.
Yeah.
I know you had been a listener to my old podcast, Rewild Yourself, and I had done a lot of episodes covering this topic, and I always found going into the topic of death at any level sure freaks people out. And this topic is a challenging one, but at the same time it's so important. So yeah, just curious what you
Yeah.
have to share about that.
So this is another one of those, big turning points in my life that still is guiding my life. Is with my father passed. Very very close with my father. A beautiful soul, still is. And he was diagnosed with mesothelioma and had about 18 months of life living in this plane before he moved on. And in that time period, we had time to talk and think and plan. And interestingly enough, it wasn't till kind of closer toward the end when hospice first came for an initial visit, and they gave us just a printout of what hospice does. And on the very back, at the very bottom, there was one link, and it was like for home burials. Go to crossings.net, which is a great resource. It's a nonprofit. And so, of course, I looked that up, and I was like, wow, this is like something that we can totally do.
Mm.
And of course, it fit with my way of living. Was full circle. Just like a compost toilet.
Yeah.
It just it all comes back. And so we gathered as a family, and I said, would we be willing to do this? And my father, interesting enough at the time, he was an engineer, and he was going to, donate his body to science. But he saw that this could be really, important and helpful to us. So he said, yeah, sure. I'll be the first
Yeah.
one.
Wow.
And he handled his passing so beautifully. It was one of the most amazing experiences for anyone who was
Mm.
with or around him, to see how beautifully he handled it. And his body was withering, and he was struggling, physically, but his eyes shone. And he even said it was, in that last year of his life, was one of the best he ever had.
Wow.
And in that time, we started creating a natural home burial ground, and it was surprisingly easy. In a world where there's so many rules, where you can't even pee behind a tree without getting in trouble. You wouldn't think that you could
Yeah.
actually do something like this, but it was actually very easy. Every state's a little bit different, but most states allow home burial. You don't need a lot of land to do it either. So the process was calling the health department. They came out, and we said, look, this is the area we want to do this. And they said, okay, is it 100 foot from a well? Is it 100 foot from the creek? Yep. Okay, you're good. Go ahead.
Wow.
And then we went and got a surveyor to plat it. And then we basically registered that plat, with the building permit department, and that was it. That was
Wow.
it. Nobody else ever came around, ever said anything.
Jeez. Like
And
you
then
said,
we
to
went,
imagine that level of autonomy is even like allowed in this incredibly,
yes,
like regulated culture is surprising.
I'm grateful for it. And it's not by accident. There's a lot of people who really make sure that it stays an option.
Hmm.
You can imagine, there would be interest to not have this piece possible, but there's people that are aware, and there's a great overarching organization called um, National Home Funeral Association, and they share all the resources for not only creating a home cemetery, but how do you have sort of a home funeral. So I almost kind of break these into two different things. So there's a home funeral and sort of home death care, and then there's home or natural burial. So even if you don't have natural burial, let's say that you're being buried at the church is really important to you, but you would like to have a home funeral. So we did both, and we'd never done any of this before, so it wasn't like we had any understanding or experience other than the things we'd read, and just being a strong family and willing to do it. So through hospice, my father passed, and the hospice nurse comes out, says yes, he's passed. She took the death certificate to the hospice doctor. He signed it, and she brought it back. So he never left. He never had to leave us at
Hmm.
all.
Yeah.
We went and got dry ice, which is a real key piece of this, to keep your loved ones at home. And we put him on dry ice in our living room, set up pictures, candles, and sat with him for 3 days.
Oh, yeah. That's awesome.
Um, yeah. Now I'd heard other traditions talk about 3 days. There's a passing. There's something that's happening. And so I wasn't sure of that, but I was like, well, I'm not in a hurry. I want to, I want to stay, involved with my father as much as I can. And there was a transition. And it wasn't really obvious until the third day. And then, he is coloring, something about it was just very obvious on the third day that he was gone. And I would not have felt comfortable burying him before that. So it was very fascinating, very interesting to do this and to see. And I'm not saying what it was or what was going on, but there was a transition
Hmm.
happening, and there was a difference on that third day. And then we went out, and we dug the grave ourselves, and we buried him ourselves. There was nobody else involved, just us as a family, and it was very powerful. It wasn't easy, but it was beautiful. And going through that experience and having the opportunity to be that involved with it has really changed my life, and has created a focus for helping others understand what's possible, and actually working toward creating a natural burial ground, a public one, here in Maryland right now.
Oh,
So
wow. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a whole full circle thing, and, even from just an ecological standpoint, yes, and the concept of a natural burial or green burial is that you're not embalmed, you're not using metal or precious hardwoods in your casket, you're not putting concrete liners over your casket. These are all the things that happen in traditional burial, conventional burial. Just tons of resources go into the process, and you're really closing yourself off from being, reabsorbed into the ecosystem. And it's like you said, it's like sort of that last your last act is pulling even more resources as you leave.
Yeah.
It's not like you didn't take enough while you were here. It's like, well, you're not getting any when I go.
And you can't
Um,
have my body. Like, I'm going to
right,
deny the ecology my borrowed nutrients, my borrowed elements, my borrowed water. It's mine.
right.
Right.
I'm gonna fill it full of chemicals too.
Yeah, you can't have
Um,
it ever.
so it's interesting, and even a lot of people who identify as environmentalists don't have a plan for when they die, and probably inevitably they will go through a traditional process, and
Hmm.
and it will not be sort of environmental. So there's that, and then there's just the economics. So we designed this home cemetery. We got a good quarter acre up there now, and we spent maybe $2,000, I think, for the surveyor and the whole process. And so we buried my father, and then a couple months later we buried his mother, who was waiting for him to pass. She was like 96.
Wow.
We did the same process with her, and buried her ourselves. And so that's two now for $2,000,
Yeah.
and there's space up there for 30 or 40 more of us that won't cost us a single penny.
Right. Oh, wow. Yeah, because having been through this with several families and watching, not only is there like all of these expenses, it's at a time where things get so chaotic when somebody passes that you just find yourself spending and spending and spending because you're just getting through it. But also, I find it really disempowering to have so many sort of administrators get involved in things, and you get this. It's like this with medical care. It's like this with births, where it's just disempowering. Like, as if these things that we've done on our own for all of our history, that suddenly we're incapable of handling them ourselves, and we need all of these organizations, or all these administrators involved. And so I think it's just really empowering, the idea of handling it yourself. And then it sounds like it, while challenging, quite beautiful to have that time with him, rather than feeling like he's getting
Yeah.
pulled over here and pulled over there and all these different things are happening. So
Yeah,
yeah,
it,
that's
it,
really
it
cool.
helped a lot. There's a saying I'd heard that death is not an emergency,
Yeah. Right.
and I think that's the mindset for most people. Someone dies and they just think it's an emergency. Oh my gosh, we got to call someone. We got to do something. But no, it's not. It's okay. Just
Yeah.
just just stop and be with your loved one. It's like it's the other doorway. As we come into life, there's a lot of preparation. There's a lot of help, a lot of support, and I think it's just the other door. We're all going to go through, and it's just like it's okay, and let's hold love and space for our loved ones in that
Hmm.
in that transition as well. And I think one of the keys to this is the pre-planning,
Yeah.
because if you don't pre-plan, and then when someone does die, it does tailspin you.
Yeah, this isn't last minute stuff, right? That you're talking about.
It's not. Yeah, it's such valuable time spent to pre-plan, and if you think about it, you're not really even doing it for yourself. You're doing it for your loved ones.
Hmm.
You're doing it so that when you transition, that everything is understood for them. What you wanted, and it's just so much easier for them, so that they can be present and they can grieve,
Right.
and they can focus on that, and not all like arguing about what to do or making decisions, or and all these things that maybe that they're not even comfortable doing, or that wouldn't represent you in your lifetime. And a resource for this I really like is called Five Wishes. There's another nonprofit called fivewishes.org, and they have a advanced directive that's really holistic, and it's legally binding in almost all states, and you can get it probably for $1 or something off their website, or have them mail you a copy or two. and it's wonderful. It has questions, basic questions, about, do you want to be resuscitated? It does the legal stuff, but then it also says, well, what kind of environment would you like to have around you,
Hmm.
as you're passing, or, what are your burial wishes, and it gives you questions that help you think about things that, you might be struggling to think about, or don't want to think about.
Yeah.
But just doing that, sitting down for 10 minutes and doing that. And if you're uncomfortable thinking about, death and your death, that's okay. But just do it for 10 minutes. And if you want, forget about it, but just have that done, because then that will be such a gift to everyone else when your time does come.
You're very diplomatic there, because to me, it's like if you have a hard time contemplating your own death, it's like, hey, welcome to Earth. You know, pull up your big boy pants and let's get serious here. Because
Yeah.
I do think like a lot of folks almost they almost, because I think it's because of how far we've gotten from the land and how far we've gotten from the ecology. We almost think of death as like a disease or like this thing that we're collectively gonna conquer. And it's like, ew, the idea of living
Yeah.
forever anyway is like a little bit gross to me. But
Yeah.
it's like the more I know, for me, hunting has been like an incredible, starting that as an adult, it's been an incredible confrontation with death,
Mhm.
personally, but I imagine kind of anything where, I've got my wife's a school teacher, but she works privately now. And one of her students, is living on a organic farm. Her mom's a farmer, and seeing the difference in a kid who, sees chickens get slaughtered and born, things being born and things dying versus kids who don't, man, that kid is so much more
Yeah.
mature, so much more grounded, so much more wise. Like there's so much wisdom in this
Yeah.
kid. And you're like, oh,
Yeah.
that's actually normal though. It's not that kid has extra wisdom. It's that
Right.
some of that
It's
gets
just their
cut off.
experience.
Yeah. They just are having actual life experiences. But, you know,
And that's another, yeah, that's, so I would say it's another thing that was really good about having the home, funeral, is all of his grandchildren, from like age 4 to like age 14 were there. And that was the first time that they'd experienced, a loved one
wow.
dying. And they saw just how we held each other and how we did it together. And like, that's what's now normal to them. And I think gives them a stronger sense of security, about, their own, how they will be cared for and loved, when the time comes. And then, both our children were born at home as well. And I know one of my younger nieces was there when our last child was born, and it's intense. It's
Yeah.
awesome. But to be around it does give you that experience. It's not separate. It's not behind closed doors. It just is what it is. And another funny story is we have a compost toilet, so the guys don't pee in it. If we have to, when we're going, we do. But we always go outside and pee. And my son was just born into that being normal. So no matter what the weather, every morning the most normal thing, he gets up and he goes outside and pees. Even if it's snowing, doesn't
Right.
matter, and
Right.
there's no thought in his head about it. It just
Right.
that just is
How
the
you do
way
it.
that life is.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That's awesome, man. Um, I guess in closing, I wanted to ask you about okay, so when I look at the stories you've been telling and sort of what your life history is like, you've walked a really alternative path, and it's brought you to places that many people would never see. You've had experiences that many people would never have, and it seems like it's been fruitful for you and successful for you. Um, and I'm curious what your input or advice for folks is about that, because it's so easy to fall into a structured life that you didn't structure, and to that kind of midlife crisis that happens when people realize like, oh man, I haven't even like followed my own internal compass. And it seems like you've been doing that from really early on. So I'm curious like how that's
Yeah.
happened, and then and why, and then and how you maybe um, how you suggest other folks kind of find a path for themselves.
Well, let's just skip to the way, I'd recommend people to find, a way. And I would say to know that it's doesn't need to be complicated, to begin, getting involved with growing food. I know there seems to be seems to feel like there's a lot you have to learn or big barriers to it. And there's actually very simple, easy ways to start growing, especially when you're working with perennials. If you want to start planting some fruit trees, some fruit bushes, and some nut trees, it is so simple. It's not annual agriculture and gardening and all that can actually be, quite intensive, and it can be a great learning experience, but you don't have to necessarily start there. In reality, a lot of people I've watched actually, evolve from doing annuals to perennials because they realize after a while how much work those annuals are, and then for the perennials, how little they are for what you get back. So I would encourage, people to start thinking about just jump right into working with, planting some fruit trees and nut trees and fruit bushes. And that can be very simple and just sort of, if you have access to land, and if you don't have your own land, find somewhere. The learning experience, you don't have to own these things, but the learning that you get from doing them is really valuable.
Yeah.
And it really puts you in the cycle of things too, especially with the perennials, because then you're really working through the seasons and the years, and you're now sort of tacking with those cycles once you start to plant, because now you're part of it. And starting to prepare a piece of ground for planting is really simple. You just want to get organic matter layered up on it, whether that's newspaper, cardboard, compost, straw, wood chips, whatever you have access to. You just kind of want to layer it like lasagna. You just want to start getting that material out there and let it sit. Ideally do this like a full year in advance. You can jump right in and get started and do those layers around what you plant. But if you're thinking, you're listening to this right now, well, hey, it's, the middle of summer, and, go out there and just an area that you think you want to plant that's full of weeds or grass or whatever it is, and just right on top of that, just start layering it. And what will happen is those layers will kill off the plants underneath. Ideally do this in full sun if you have it. And that starts to kill those layers down, and that starts turning into organic matter for the soil and nutrients. And then those layers start to slowly break down. Fungi move in. So the fungi start moving in because there's moisture, because you've layered it up. So moisture's hanging down there like a sponge. Fungi move in. They start breaking that down. They start feeding that soil cycle. And it's just like it's turning into compost for you. You don't have to do anything but just throw some stuff on the ground, right? Don't have to dig. You don't have to make compost. You don't have to do any of this stuff. You don't have to understand any of the chemistry about it. Layer it, throw it down, wait, it's going to start doing it. Nature's going to do its thing. You come back and you come in there and it's starting to get all rich and black, and you start planting your trees and your bushes and maybe a few companion plants, a couple of perennial companion plants around your tree. Create a little ecosystem for it, a little patch, a little food forest patch, and you'll just be amazed at how well it does very much on its own. The energy is already here. It's just a matter of sort of, interacting with it and doing it in the easiest way possible. Thinking you need to learn and read a whole bunch of books, stuff like that can kind of lead to, what is it called? Analysis paralysis.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I encourage you just to go for it, just go for it. And I would encourage you maybe not to maybe plant your favorite fruits that you're thinking about. Like, for example, where we're at, peaches don't work well here, especially organically. I love peaches, but I'm not going to plant peaches, and same with, apples and pears. They take quite a bit of input and have a lot of disease issues where I'm at. So they're not going to be my number one choice. And so, find out what grows really well with low input in your area, but that is also fruitful and attractive, and start there. A lot of times the berries are easy. Berry bushes can be very rewarding, quick returns, easy to grow. So build your confidence and learn more about food forests. In my first book, Edible Landscaping with a Permaculture Twist, it's all how-to. It's all things that I've done. And it's just like, okay, here's the very simple way to approach setting up your food forest. Instead of thinking about or reading about the complexity of food forest design, which could really stump you, you're like, okay, well, I'm just going to plant a fruit tree with a couple companions around it. How's that?
I like that,
And then
because
maybe,
I've been a little overwhelmed by a couple of the textbooks I own.
yeah. He's like, okay, well, 20 feet over, hey, I'm going to do another little patch,
Mm-hmm.
so that I got some space between my small, mid-sized fruit trees. Or if you got more space, let's go 40 foot over there and let's put a nut tree in there, and just do patches. And then over time, if you want, you can extend those patches and it can all start to blend together, and it'll turn into that dynamic, multi-layered, super, complex food forest system. But you don't have to think about that or really know anything about it at all.
Mm. Wow. Very inspiring, man. Really, really beautiful.
Cool.
I'm very much looking forward to, first of all, it's been a pleasure to talk to you today. I'm really looking forward to coming down in September and seeing your operation and getting to spend a little time with you. And hopefully Paw Paws are ripe then, because
There'll be Paw Paws, don't you worry. There'll be Paw Paws. There might be some other cool fruits happening, hardy kiwis and some che fruits, and it'll be a lot of fun. And that's great for the people listening there. When you come and do the show, then they're gonna start to get a lot of visuals of it as well with you and I there. So I look forward to that. And thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed this.
Oh, I'd love to have you back on sometime. I wanted to hit a few different things, but there's obviously a lot there, especially when we got talking about those nut trees. I'd like to talk more about that in the future. So
yes, because I think that does hit on with the hunting and just many layers there, and that's definitely a focus of mine, which I'd be happy to go into more detail on for sure.
Tell everybody the websites, the social media, the books, all those kind of things.
Well, ecologiadesign.com is kind of just a great landing spot for all the things that I have going on, and from there you could tap into Facebook, YouTube, Instagram. I'm at Permaculture Ninja. But, so I'd say yeah. So Ecologia Design, I would say from there you could see about our books, and it's actually a very informative site. You can get a lot of understanding for a lot of the things that we've talked about, from natural burial to the nut trees, agroforestry to herb spirals to swales. There's a lot of good, just free information on our site to peruse.
Great. So I think I'm starting with one of those herb spirals. Actually, that feels like pretty low hanging fruit for me. So,
and they're cool because not only are they beautiful and abundant, but they create habitat. So you're creating an ecological balance with it. And I'll have to send you my first book because the first chapter is on how to build herb spirals. So I'll have to get a copy up to you.
Thanks for listening to the WildFed podcast. Help us grow this show by subscribing and leaving us a rating and review. It ensures better rankings and more advertiser interest, which translates directly into better shows, more awesome guests, and a constant stream of fresh new content. Have a question you'd like answered on the show, or a hunting, fishing, or foraging trip you'd like to host us on? Email us at info@wild-fed.com. If you still haven't seen season 1 of the WildFed TV show, you can go to myoutdoortv.com, grab yourself a free trial subscription, and then check out all 10 episodes. Season 2 of WildFed premieres on Outdoor Channel in early 2022. And be sure to visit our website, wild-fed.com, to check out our store for WildFed hats, stickers, and more. WildFed. Food is all around you.